Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the darkest mysteries that haunt our world. Today we dive into a chilling case that shook a small town to its core, but the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. It all began on a quiet autumn evening in the small, tight-knit community of Maplewood. The town was known for its picturesque streets, friendly neighbors, and a sense of safety that made everyone feel at home. But that sense of security was shattered when 17-year-old Angela Martinez vanished without a trace. Angela was a bright, popular high school senior with dreams of becoming a journalist. She had been last seen leaving the local library, where she had been studying for an upcoming exam. Her parents reported her missing when she didn't return home that night, and the entire town rallied together to search for her. Flyers with her smiling face were plastered on every corner, and volunteers scoured the woods, parks, and nearby rivers. But as days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The police initially suspected a runaway case, but Angela's parents insisted that their daughter would never leave without telling them. There were no signs of a struggle, no suspicious activity reported, and no leads to follow. The case grew cold, leaving the community in a state of unease. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would unravel in the most unexpected way. The library, where Angela was last seen, became a focal point for the investigation. Security footage showed her leaving alone, her backpack slung over one shoulder, seemingly in good spirits. She had texted a friend earlier that evening, making plans to meet up the next day, which only added to the confusion surrounding her disappearance. The police interviewed her friends, teachers, and neighbors, but no one could provide any useful information. It was as if Angela had simply vanished into thin air. As the days passed, the town's initial shock turned into a growing sense of dread. Rumors began to circulate, with some suggesting that Angela had been involved in something dangerous, while others whispered about the possibility of a stranger passing through town. The police expanded their search, bringing in canine units and even divers to check nearby bodies of water. But nothing turned up. Angela's parents, desperate for answers, offered a reward for any information that could lead to their daughter's whereabouts, but even that yielded no results. The community held candlelight vigils, praying for Angela's safe return, but as time went on, those prayers began to feel more like a farewell than a plea. The media picked up the story, and soon Maplewood was in the national spotlight. Reporters descended on the town, interviewing anyone who might have known Angela or seen something unusual that night. The attention brought a mix of hope and frustration. Hope that someone, somewhere, might come forward with a crucial piece of information, and frustration that the case seemed to be going nowhere. The police, under increasing pressure, vowed to leave no stone unturned. But as the weeks turned into months, even their determination began to wane. Angela's disappearance left a void in the community that was impossible to fill. Her classmates hung posters in the hallways, and her teachers struggled to make sense of the tragedy. The once bustling streets of Maplewood felt quieter, as if the town itself was mourning the loss of one of its own. But beneath the surface, there was a growing sense of unease, a feeling that something far more sinister was at play. The disappearance of Angela Martinez was not just a random act of violence. It was the first thread in a web of darkness that would soon engulf the entire town. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the people of Maplewood began to realize that the truth they were searching for might be far more horrifying than they could have ever imagined. 3 months after Angela's disappearance, a shocking discovery was made. A hiker stumbled upon a backpack hidden deep in the woods, miles away from where Angela was last seen. Inside the backpack were Angela's belongings, her school ID, a notebook, and a water bottle. But what sent chills down everyone's spine was the presence of a second set of items: a man's wallet, a set of keys, and a blood-stained shirt. The wallet belonged to a man named Edward Harris, a local handyman who had been living in Maplewood for over a decade. Edward was well liked in the community, known for his friendly demeanor and willingness to help anyone in need. The discovery of his belongings alongside Angela's raised immediate suspicions. Was Edward involved in her disappearance, or was he another victim? The police brought Edward in for questioning, but he denied any involvement. He claimed his wallet and keys had been stolen weeks before Angela went missing, and he had no idea how they ended up in the woods. The blood on the shirt was tested, but the results were inconclusive. With no concrete evidence, the police were forced to release him. The town was left divided. Some believed Edward was innocent, while others were convinced he was hiding something. The discovery of the backpack reignited the investigation, and the police began to focus their efforts on the area where it had been found. Teams of officers and volunteers combed the woods, searching for any additional clues that might shed light on what had happened to Angela. The dense forest, with its thick underbrush and winding trails, made the search difficult, but the possibility of finding something, anything, kept them going. As the search continued, more questions began to surface. Why had the backpack been hidden so far from where Angela was last seen? Was it an attempt to throw off the investigation, or was there another reason? The blood-stained shirt added another layer of mystery. Whose blood was it? And what had happened to the person it belonged to? The police considered the possibility that Edward might have been attacked or even killed. But without a body or any other evidence, it was impossible to say for sure. The uncertainty only deepened the sense of unease that had settled over the town. Edward, meanwhile, found himself at the center of a storm. Once a respected member of the community, he was now the subject of whispers and sidewise glances. Some of his neighbors stood by him, insisting that he was a good man who had been unfairly targeted, while others began to distance themselves, afraid of what his involvement might mean. Edward maintained his innocence, but the weight of suspicion was heavy. He stopped attending community events and spent most of his time at home, trying to avoid the growing scrutiny. The police, determined to get to the bottom of the case, began to dig deeper into Edward's background. They interviewed his friends, family, and co-workers, looking for any signs that he might have been involved in Angela's disappearance. They also revisited the area where the backpack had been found, hoping to uncover more clues. But despite their efforts, the case seemed to hit a wall. The backpack was the only piece of evidence they had, and it wasn't enough to build a case against Edward or anyone else. As the weeks passed, the initial excitement of the discovery began to fade, replaced by a sense of frustration and helplessness. The people of Maplewood, who had once been so hopeful that the backpack would lead to answers, now found themselves grappling with the same questions they had been asking for months. What had happened to Angela? And who was responsible? The backpack had brought them closer to the truth, but it had also revealed just how complex and elusive that truth might be. And as the investigation continued, the town braced itself for the possibility that the answers they were searching for might be more horrifying than they could have ever imagined. As the investigation continued, a startling revelation came to light. A background check on Edward Harris revealed that he had a criminal record in another state. Years ago, he had been arrested for breaking and entering, but the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. This new information cast a dark shadow over Edward's reputation, and the community began to view him in a different light. The once trusted handyman was now seen as a potential threat, and the whispers that had followed him since the discovery of the backpack grew louder. People began to question how well they really knew Edward, and whether his friendly demeanor had been a facade all along. Meanwhile, a local journalist digging into the case uncovered something even more disturbing. Angela had been working on a school project about unsolved crimes in the area, and her research had led her to a series of disappearances that had occurred over the past 2 decades. All of the victims were young women, and all of them had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The journalist began to suspect that Angela's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern. The police, initially skeptical, decided to take a closer look at the journalist's findings. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the department. The cold cases bore eerie similarities to Angela's disappearance. Each of the missing women had last been seen in or around Maplewood, and in each case, there had been no witnesses, no evidence, and no leads. The police began to piece together a timeline, mapping out the disappearances and looking for connections. They found that the victims had all been around the same age, with similar backgrounds and interests. Some had been students, like Angela, while others had been young professionals. But they all shared one thing in common. They had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. As the investigation deepened, the police began to suspect that they were dealing with a serial predator, someone who had been operating in the shadows for years, preying on young women and evading detection. The realization was chilling, and it raised a host of new questions. How had the perpetrator managed to avoid suspicion for so long? And why had no one noticed the pattern before? The police knew they were facing a formidable adversary, someone who was careful, methodical, and deeply dangerous. The community, already on edge, was gripped by fear as news of the possible serial predator spread. Parents kept their children closer, and women began to avoid walking alone at night. The once peaceful streets of Maplewood now felt like a minefield, with danger lurking around every corner. The police urged residents to remain vigilant and report any suspicious activity, but the sense of unease was palpable. People began to look at their neighbors with suspicion, wondering if the person next door could be capable of such heinous crimes. Edward Harris, already under scrutiny, became a focal point of the investigation. The police began to dig deeper into his past, looking for any connections to the other disappearances. They interviewed his former co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances, searching for clues that might link him to the crimes. But despite their efforts, they found nothing concrete. Edward continued to maintain his innocence, but the weight of suspicion was heavy. He knew that in the eyes of many he was already guilty, and there was little he could do to change their minds. As the investigation continued, the police began to explore other avenues. They revisited the scenes of the previous disappearances, hoping to find something they might have missed. They also reached out to other law enforcement agencies, looking for similar cases that might provide a lead. But the trail was cold, and the answers they were searching for remained elusive. The people of Maplewood, desperate for closure, could only watch and wait, hoping that the police would finally uncover the truth. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the sense of dread only grew deeper. The town was caught in the grip of a nightmare, and there was no telling when or if it would ever end. With the spotlight now on Edward Harris, the police intensified their investigation. They searched his home and found a hidden compartment in his workshop. Inside were photographs of the missing women, newspaper clippings about their disappearances, and a collection of personal items that appeared to belong to them. The evidence was damning, and Edward was arrested on suspicion of multiple counts of kidnapping and murder. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community, as people struggled to reconcile the image of the friendly handyman with the sinister figure now being painted by the police. The photographs, in particular, were deeply unsettling, each one a haunting reminder of the lives that had been lost. But just when it seemed like the case was finally coming to a close, a shocking twist emerged. While in custody, Edward confessed, but not to the crimes he was accused of. He admitted to being a voyeur who had been secretly observing the women in the photographs, but he insisted he had never harmed any of them. He claimed that someone else had planted the evidence in his workshop to frame him. The police were skeptical, but they couldn't ignore the possibility that Edward was telling the truth. They began to re-examine the evidence, and that's when they discovered something that changed everything. The blood on the shirt found in the woods didn't belong to Angela or Edward. It belonged to a third, unidentified person. The case took a dramatic turn as the police realized they were dealing with a much more complex and sinister plot than they had initially thought. The revelation threw the investigation into chaos. If Edward wasn't the perpetrator, then who was? And why had they gone to such lengths to frame him? The police began to consider the possibility that the real killer was still out there, watching and waiting. They revisited the evidence, looking for any clues they might have missed. The hidden compartment in Edward's workshop, once seen as a smoking gun, now seemed like a carefully constructed trap. The photographs and personal items, while disturbing, didn't provide any direct links to the crimes. The police were left with more questions than answers, and the pressure to solve the case was mounting. Edward, meanwhile, found himself in a precarious position. While his confession had cast doubt on his guilt, it had also revealed a darker side of his character. The admission that he had been spying on the women in the photographs was deeply troubling, and it raised questions about his true intentions. The police continued to hold him as a person of interest, but they also began to explore other leads. They interviewed his acquaintances, looking for anyone who might have had a grudge against him or a reason to frame him. They also revisited the scenes of the disappearances, searching for any evidence that might have been overlooked. As the investigation continued, the police began to piece together a timeline of events. They discovered that the disappearances had occurred at regular intervals, suggesting a pattern. They also found that the victims had all been in the same general area before they vanished, leading them to suspect that the perpetrator had been stalking them. The realization was chilling, and it raised the possibility that the killer was someone who knew the town well, someone who could move through it unnoticed. The community, already on edge, was gripped by a new wave of fear. The idea that the real killer was still out there, possibly living among them, was almost too much to bear. People began to look at their neighbors with suspicion, wondering if the person next door could be capable of such heinous crimes. The police urged residents to remain vigilant and report any suspicious activity, but the sense of unease was palpable. The town was caught in the grip of a nightmare, and there was no telling when or if it would ever end. The search for the truth had taken a dark and unexpected turn, and the people of Maplewood could only watch and wait, hoping that the police would finally uncover the answers they so desperately needed. The final breakthrough came when a tip led the police to an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, they found a hidden basement that had been converted into a makeshift prison. The walls were covered in photographs, maps, and detailed notes about each of the missing women. But the most chilling discovery was a journal belonging to the real perpetrator, a man named Victor Lane. Victor was a former police officer who had been dismissed from the force years ago for misconduct. He had been living in Maplewood under the radar, using his knowledge of law enforcement to evade suspicion. The journal revealed that Victor had been stalking the women for years, carefully planning their abductions and covering his tracks. He had framed Edward Harris to throw the police off his trail, and he had been watching the investigation unfold with a sense of twisted satisfaction. The discovery of the farmhouse was a turning point in the case. The police, armed with the evidence from Victor's journal, moved quickly to apprehend him. Victor was found hiding in a nearby cabin, where he had been living under a false identity. He offered no resistance when he was arrested, almost as if he had been expecting it. The police searched the cabin and found more evidence linking him to the disappearances, including personal items belonging to the victims and detailed plans for future abductions. It was clear that Victor had been planning to continue his reign of terror, and the thought of what might have happened if he hadn't been caught sent shivers down the spines of everyone involved in the case. Victor's arrest brought a sense of relief to the community, but it also raised difficult questions. How had a former police officer been able to operate undetected for so long, and why had no one noticed the signs? The journal provided some answers, revealing that Victor had used his knowledge of police procedures to stay one step ahead of the investigation. He had chosen his victims carefully, targeting women who were unlikely to be missed immediately and avoiding any patterns that might draw attention. He had also manipulated the investigation, planting evidence to frame Edward and divert suspicion away from himself. The level of planning and calculation was staggering, and it left the police and the community grappling with the realization that they had been outmaneuvered by a man they had once trusted. As the details of Victor's crimes came to light, the town of Maplewood was forced to confront the dark reality of what had happened. The disappearances, once seen as isolated incidents, were now understood to be part of a larger, more sinister pattern. The victims, once faceless names, were remembered as individuals whose lives had been cut short by a man who had betrayed the very trust placed in him. The community held memorials for the missing women, honoring their memories and vowing to never forget what had happened. Edward Harris, meanwhile, was released from custody, but his life would never be the same. The stigma of being a suspect in such a high-profile case followed him, and he struggled to rebuild his reputation. He moved away from Maplewood, hoping to start fresh, but the scars of the ordeal remained. The town, too, was forever changed. The sense of safety and trust that had once defined Maplewood was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. The case of Angela Martinez and the other missing women served as a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most peaceful towns. And as the people of Maplewood tried to move on, they knew that the truth they had uncovered would haunt them for years to come.